So today we're going to dive into the concept of Healthspan and some of the strengths and weaknesses, I think, of this term and how it's currently used both in the scientific literature and more in the popular space. So what I want to start with is just setting a few definitions so that everybody's on the same page when we talk about some of these terms that are important and used a lot in the field. So let's start with chronological age, because I think this is probably the easiest of the terms that we're going to talk about today. Really, all we mean there is how old you are in units of time. And usually that's going to be years, right? The number of birthdays you've had, although obviously you can get more precise than that. The reason why chronological age is pretty easy to understand is it's completely unambiguous, right? There's no question, unless you don't actually know when you were born, of how old you are chronologically. And that's different from biological age, which is a very ambiguous term right now. So I'm going to use the definition of how old your cells and tissues are based on physiological function. And the reason why this is ambiguous is I don't think that we have any sort of consensus on what we mean by physiological function. There are lots and lots of different things that you can measure. And so that means we don't really have any consensus on how to measure biological age. And so I just think it's important to appreciate that, at least for now, when people talk about biological age clocks, that really isn't accepted among the scientific community, that these things are actually measuring biological age. And if you're interested in doing a little bit of a deeper dive on this, I'd encourage you to check out the episode on biological age. And we'll be doing some upcoming videos on biological age clocks and, what they're useful for, how they're developed, and whether they're actionable. But for now, let's just stick with this definition and just appreciate that, unlike chronological age, well, everybody agrees on how we measure chronological age. Biological age, we don't really have a consensus definition for how to do that quantitatively. The other thing that's useful to just appreciate is, for an individual, biological age doesn't necessarily have to equal chronological age. And this, again, has to do with how well your body is functioning based on your chronological age. At the population level, biological age will equal chronological age, but for each individual, you could be more healthy or less healthy than the population on average, or have a biological age that is greater or lesser than your chronological age. The third term I want to just talk about is lifespan. Again, this is an unambiguous term, and it's also quantitative, meaning that we can measure it very easily. So lifespan really is just defined as the time from birth until death. Again, there's really no ambiguity about whether or not somebody is alive or dead, and therefore there's no ambiguity about that length of time. And this is also to differentiate it from the main topic of today's episode, which is healthspan, which is different from lifespan and is also ambiguous. And again, healthspan is an ambiguous term because we don't have a lot of consensus in the field for exactly how we define it or how we measure it. And importantly, I'm going to state quite strongly that healthspan is not a quantitative term, at least for now. It's a qualitative term. So I'm going to define healthspan as the high functioning period of life. We'll come back to this and differentiate it from some of the other definitions that are out there. But part of the reason why it's qualitative and not quantitative is that I think how we define high functioning, right, is a little bit relative, and it can mean different things to different people. And there's really no consensus in the field about how to actually measure this. So again, chronological age, unambiguous; quantitative, we know how to measure it; biological age, ambiguous, we don't really know how to measure it; lifespan, unambiguous; quantitative, we know how to measure it; healthspan, ambiguous; and qualitative, meaning that, at least for now, we don't have a way to actually measure healthspan precisely. One of the things that's useful to appreciate about healthspan is how new this term really is, both in the scientific literature and in more of the popular culture. It's really just in the last, I would say 10 years that this term has really started to catch on both in the scientific community and outside of the scientific community. So this graphic here shows the appearance of the word health span in the scientific literature over time. And what you can appreciate is, first of all, that it's really seeing an exponential growth in the use of this term in the scientific literature, and also that it's really just been in the last decade or so that health span as a scientific term has become widely used. And I think this mirrors more or less the prevalence of the concept of health span outside of the scientific literature in the more popular realm. So health span is relatively new as a concept. And so one of the things that I think, naturally follows from that is that we're still sort of figuring out what it means. And again, this gets to my point that even within the scientific literature, the term health span is actually misused quite a bit. If you ever see people in the title of their papers claim that they have shown that something increases or decreases health span, that's not really scientifically valid because there is no agreed upon way to measure health span. Statistically, you can't actually show that you have increased or decreased something that you can't actually measure. That's just useful to appreciate. But as a concept, I think health span is extremely powerful. And there are lots of ways to think about health span as a concept. Again, I sort of gave the definition of the high functioning period of life. I like this graphic because it's very simple, but it illustrates the idea that as we go throughout our lives, our health generally tends to decline. That's represented by the change in shading from blue, which is meant to represent good health, to red, which is meant to represent poor health. And for most people, that change is gradual. And, it happens somewhere around the middle of life. And, it's sort of interesting to think about how the shift from good health to poor health has changed over time. I'll come back to that concept in a couple of minutes. But gradually over life, most people's health declines, and many people end up spending many years, sometimes even multiple decades, in relatively poor health towards the end of life. Now, the goal of geroscience, longevity, aging research, one of the goals is to really change that dynamic and create a situation where health is maintained until very late in life. And so that's the bottom graphic here, the optimal health span graphic, as opposed to what the typical aging process looks like, where high quality health is maintained out until near the very end of life. And it's really just compressed into those last few years of life, this decline from very good health to very poor health. So health span in this case is optimized over the life course so that a much greater period of life is spent in optimal health. And that's really the goal at Optispan. That's our name, optimal health span. The goal here is really to maintain that high level of function, optimal health span, as long as possible for as many people as possible. So again, I think from a conceptual perspective, this is pretty easy to understand, and it's extremely powerful in illustrating the promise of proactive preventative healthcare and interventions that target the biology of aging. But the term is often misused, as I've sort of already alluded to, particularly, I think, in the scientific literature sometimes and in the longevity community, when people start talking about being able to measure health span or interventions that can increase or decrease health span. I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm going to say it again. When people claim that they have shown that something increases or decreases health span, I would just suggest you take a pretty skeptical view of those claims. And certainly from a mathematical or statistical perspective, those kinds of claims are not valid. Again, you can't prove that you have increased or decreased something that you can't actually measure. So just keep that in mind when you hear people make those sorts of claims. So again, things to be aware of. There's no consensus on how to measure health span. Again, any claims in the scientific literature or in the popular press or media or on YouTube channels such as this one, we don't actually claim that, or in advertisements you might see for supplements or things like that. If people are claiming that they have increased or decreased health span, just be cautious of those kinds of claims. Particularly in the scientific literature, I think it's important to understand what people have actually measured when they make these kinds of claims. And, we'll talk more about this in future videos and do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the ways that people actually go about trying to measure health span or health in scientific studies. But just to give a sort of a specific example here, you will often see in studies that are done in laboratory mice with different interventions, say it's a drug or a dietary dietary intervention or something like intermittent fasting, you'll see people claim that they have treated animals with a specific intervention to increase their health span. Yet when you actually go and look at what they measured, in many cases, they'll only measure 1 or 2 or at most 3 different parameters that change with age. And oftentimes, probably the most often thing that you'll see is what people will do is they'll measure something called a glucose tolerance test or insulin sensitivity. And the way this is done, if any of you have ever had a glucose tolerance test, you go into the doctor, they make you drink a sugar drink, a glucola, and then they measure your glucose, say, every 30 minutes for the next couple of hours. That's a glucose tolerance test. And what that's measuring is your body's ability to restore normal blood glucose levels after a non-physiological high amount of glucose is given in a very short amount of time. Turns out in laboratory mice, you can do exactly the same thing. You can inject them with glucose, sugar, directly into their blood, and then monitor over time how long it takes them to restore normal blood glucose. So you can do a glucose tolerance test in mice, just like you can in people. And it turns out with age in mice, the rapidity at which they're able to restore normal blood glucose levels gets longer. So there's a decline in glucose homeostasis with age in mice, just like there is on average in people. If you also measure insulin, you can also get a measure of insulin sensitivity. So oftentimes what you'll see people do is they'll treat mice with an intervention and show that they can improve glucose homeostasis or the response on the glucose tolerance test. But then what they'll claim in the title of the paper is they have improved health span. Is a glucose tolerance test the same as health span? I think it should be obvious to everyone listening. The answer is no. Is it one parameter that might give you a hint about health span? Maybe, probably in some cases, but no, in a lot of cases it's not. So again, just trying to make the point that it's important to know what people are actually measuring when you evaluate some of these claims that they may make in their scientific studies, or when those scientific studies get interpreted, or perhaps more often misinterpreted on the internet, in the popular media, things like that. So again, claims that a product increases health span are overstated at best. I think, as we all know, sometimes they're snake oil at worst. And that's true for a diet, a supplement, a drug, really any sort of intervention you could imagine. So, okay, let's take a step back now and talk maybe about a better way to think about health span, at least in my opinion. So I think if you look in the scientific literature and how this has evolved over time, probably the most common definition of health span you'll come across is the period of life spent free from chronic disease and disability. And I'll admit, I used to use this as my definition of health span 10 years ago before I really thought about it and learned better, hopefully. So I think this is okay as a starting point, but there's lots of reasons why this definition doesn't work in the real world, right? So one is, if you look at the American population right now, 50% of people have a chronic disease, okay? So do we want to say that 50% of Americans have zero health span? That doesn't make any sense. That is not a useful definition of health span in the real world. Likewise, I certainly wouldn't want to go around claiming that anybody who has a disability has no health span. Again, that doesn't make sense. And I think the reason why this definition doesn't make sense is because health is not binary. It's not a 1 or a 0. You don't go from having 100% health one day to having 0% health the next day. So I think what we need is a more nuanced view of health span that takes into account the fact that health is really a continuous variable, right? There's many gradations of health. And also, health doesn't start and then stop, right? You can have a decline in health, and then you can improve in health, and then you can have a decline in health. So over time, as we get older, on average, health is going to decline. But it's not a continuous decline, it's not a linear decline, and it's not binary. It doesn't go from 0 to 1. So any definition of health span, I think, to be useful in the real world needs to take into account the sort of more complex nature of health and the way that we actually would go about measuring it. So let's cross that definition out, and let's try to think of maybe a better way to think about health and health span. So what about the high functioning period of life? I think this is better. One of the challenges here, though, is, again, this is ambiguous. What do we mean by high functioning? High functioning is going to mean different things to different people. So we have to start to get towards a consensus of what we mean by high functioning before we can really have any sort of hope of measuring this from a quantitative perspective in a way that's going to be accepted. So it's closer, but maybe not quite there. I kind of like the idea of thinking about health and health span as a continuous function, right? And so this is a made up sort of health curve of a person over their entire life, where we've got health on the y-axis and chronological age on the x-axis. And as we've sort of already talked about, for most people, health declines gradually over their entire life, but it's not monotonic, it's not linear, it goes up and down. People have health challenges and then they can come back from those health challenges. So it's kind of bumpy at the individual level. But over time, as we get older, our health generally declines. And then at some point, your health reaches zero. And that's when mortality sets in. So that's the end of life. So for this particular example here of this made up individual, although this might more or less represent my health curve up to about age 40, for this made up individual, right, their lifespan was something about like 85 or 86, where their health curve reached zero. But they had, ups and downs as they went throughout their life. And one of the reasons why I really like this sort of view of health span is it, first of all, takes into account the fact that health is not binary. And you can also sort of plot real life on top of this graphic, right? And so again, this is sort of an idealized, but I'd actually encourage everyone listening to maybe do this exercise. Draw out your own health span curve to the point that you're at in your own life right now. And think about how your health has changed over time. So this particular individual, was pretty healthy when he was younger. Got married. Maybe, we sometimes let ourselves go a little bit after we get married, and then you have kids and you maybe let yourself go a little bit more. And then, maybe you get into your 30s and you're like, wow, I can't do some of the stuff that I used to be able to do. I've gained 20 pounds, whatever it is. And you kind of go on a health kick and you improve your diet and you exercise regularly and your health can improve. Again, this gets back to this idea that health is not monotonic down, right? It can go up and down as we go throughout our lives. And then sometimes for some people, that doesn't last. And a lot of people, unfortunately, particularly in the United States, go down the path of obesity, maybe have a heart attack in their 40s or 50s. Health can decline quite precipitously sometimes in response to those kinds of major life health adverse events. But even after something as severe as a heart attack, there are opportunities to improve your health. So you can bring your health back up to some point. But then, of course, as we continue to get older, in 60s, 70s, maybe suffer from an autoimmune disorder, maybe have another pretty significant health event like a stroke. And then again, unfortunately for many people, there's this period of life, the last 10 years or so, that is spent in very low health until the end of life. And so I think this is a pretty, interesting way to think about health. And one of the points that I like to make is that this idea of being able to bounce back, to improve your health after it's declined, I think, encapsulates the concept of resilience. So resilience is real. It is possible to come back from health challenges, but it gets harder as we get older. So resilience, our ability to restore homeostasis, declines with age. And so it's never too late, but it's also better to start early. And so the earlier you can start to get yourself on a better health span trajectory, the better, because it's going to be easier to experience that resilience and improve your health. And so then I think, one of the nice features of looking at a health span this way is maybe we can start to get to a health span metric that encompasses sort of the overall health trajectory in life. And that could be represented by just the area under this curve. Now, again, we still would need to have better methods for actually measuring health in a continuous way, but I think that's possible. And some of these tools already exist in the literature. And if we could get consensus around that, then you could imagine this health statistic as the area under the curve being a really useful way to assess whether or not specific interventions can improve health span, how health span is changing at the population level over time, how health span is different between different groups within the population. So again, I think this is a pretty powerful quantitative way to think about health span that has a lot of advantages over the sort of messy qualitative way that people have been thinking about health span up until this point. Okay, so that was an individual health span curve. Now, if we think about health span at the population level, we sort of lose all that noise. So this is sort of an idealized graphical representation of that health span curve, health as a function of chronological age across the entire population. So now when you're looking at millions, hundreds of millions of people, all of those bumps and ups and downs sort of get averaged out, where you get this very smooth, gradual decline in health over time across the population. And again, this is made up. Like, I don't want to imply that this particular health span curve is based on any research, but I think it's pretty close to reflecting reality in America today, where, again, many people experience pretty significant declines in health in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and spend many years, sometimes multiple decades, in pretty poor health before they actually die, with a life expectancy somewhere in the 80s today. So a couple things to appreciate about this. So first of all, I think it's useful to recognize that, at least within the United States, historically, life expectancy has increased quite dramatically over the last 50, 60, 70 years. It seems to have plateaued, and nobody really knows where life expectancy is going to go in the next 10, 15, 20 years, whether it'll start to go back up in the United States, keep pretty steady where it's at, or maybe even actually decline. There's some thought that because of the obesity epidemic in particular, that life expectancy in the United States is actually going to decline a bit. I think we just don't really know at this point. But I do think it's pretty safe to say that health span certainly has not tracked with increases in life expectancy, even over the last 50 years. And definitely sick span, and that's a made up word. I made that word up, but I kind of like it. Sick span, if you define sick span as the period of life spent with a chronic disease or significant disability, again, qualitative at this point, pretty clear that sick span has increased over the last 50 years in the United States. There are a lot more people alive a lot longer with one or multiple chronic age-related diseases. Again, 50% of Americans today have a chronic disease. That number is way up from where it was a few decades ago. And importantly, that accounts for, some estimates say, as much as 90% of healthcare expenditures today. And I don't want to be alarmist, but I think it's useful to appreciate both of those last two numbers are increasing. The percent of people with chronic disease and the percent of healthcare expenditures that are going to treat people with chronic disease are going up. I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think we can get to 100% of our healthcare expenditures being spent on chronic disease. So something is going to have to change. And on an optimistic note, I think there are real opportunities to have an impact to reduce sick span in the United States and other developed countries, and to expand health span. And that's really what we're all about at Optispan. And so I think this is sort of the idealized where we would like to get to. And I honestly believe we have the tools today to get most of the way there. Now, again, this is an idealized health span curve. Do I really think that we're going to get most people out to 85 years old and then they're going to experience a dramatic decline in health and die over the period of a few weeks? Probably not. But I do think we can get a lot closer to this idealized health span curve than we are today. And I think we have the tools to do it today. I think that preventative diagnostics are a big part of it. I think that personalized health span optimization is a big part of it. And I think that these sort of generation one geroscience biomarkers and intervention have to play a role. And what I mean by that, again, geroscience is the intersection of the biology of aging with age-related functional declines and diseases. And we know that aging, biological aging, is the single greatest risk factor for nearly every major cause of death and disability in the United States and other developed countries. There's been a lot of progress at that intersection of both developing biomarkers that can measure those changes and interventions potentially that can have an impact on biological aging to delay the functional declines and diseases of old age. So I think all three of these factors together give us an opportunity to really push the health span curve out, keep a lot more people in good health for a much longer period of time. And we talk a lot about this idea of the lost decades at Optispan. I think the data is pretty clear. Most people in the United States are giving up at least 10 years of healthy longevity due to poor lifestyle choices. Now, is changing behavior easy? Absolutely not. But there is some low-hanging fruit in there that I think we can have an impact on, and those are the things that we're focusing on first at Optispan. So this is just to give you sort of an idea of the vision of where we want to get to. And then I think the interesting question is, can we do better than this? Or that's an interesting question, certainly. So can we actually push the health span curve out, achieve something that we call the longevity dividend by targeting the biology of aging to get more people out closer to what we think is around the species maximum for humans? And I don't want to get into the debate about whether 120 years is really the species maximum. Maybe we'll cover that in a future video. But I think it's pretty clear that in the absence of intervention, the longest that humans are going to live is somewhere close to 120 years. Maybe it's 130, maybe it's a little bit more than that. But that's something pretty close to where our species can get without intervention. With intervention, I don't think there's any theoretical limit to how long humans can live. So the question, though, that I would like to pose is, can we start to push the population metrics out towards something closer to this species maximum of 120 years? Importantly, that needs to be done in good health. I don't think very many people are going to be too keen on living an extra 2 decades in extremely poor health. So those two things have to be coupled. And I think there's possibilities there, but it's only going to happen if we can get to what I call generation 2 or maybe even generation 3 geroscience biomarkers and interventions. My personal view is what we know today in the field, and mostly what people are studying today in the field, isn't really going to move the needle here. It isn't really going to have a large impact on life expectancy. But I think there are some real opportunities. And one of the opportunities that I'm most excited about is being pursued by a company that we spun out of my laboratory when I was at the University of Washington called Aura Biomedical. So Aura is a company that has developed technology for what I would call massively high throughput longevity drug discovery, and has embarked on a project called the Million Molecule Challenge. The goal of the Million Molecule Challenge is really to assess 1 million interventions for their effect on longevity as a starting point to sort of find out what else is out there. How far can we actually move the needle? So just to give you a flavor for what that means in the sort of the larger overall picture in the field, if you look at the sum total of knowledge that's available today as cataloged in the Drug Age database, this is a open access database publicly available, it's about a few thousand interventions that have ever been measured for their effects on longevity in any organism. So we're really talking 2 to 3 orders of magnitude increase in the sum total of knowledge in the field. And I think that really gives us an opportunity to explore what I call sort of the dark matter of longevity and really find out, let the biology tell us what's important and what's possible. So I'm pretty excited about the Million Molecule Challenge. And we'll probably cover this in an upcoming video, do a little bit of a deeper dive on what Aura is up to and what this really entails. But I think this is one of a few ideas that people are pursuing out there that at least gives us an opportunity to get closer to this idealized longevity dividend of really moving the needle in terms of the impact on both longevity and health span going into the future. So with that, I hope what you've taken away today are some of the challenges around the way that health span is talked about a lot in the scientific literature and in the public domain. A little bit better feeling for what we mean when we say the word health span, and some of the ideas on how we can measure health span and how you can actually start to take action to improve your own health span. So I hope you found this video to be informative. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the comment section down below. From all of us at Optispan, do cool stuff with cool people to raise all boats.